Amos 1, verses 1 through 2. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers.
We wanna see your justice come round here. Let justice flow like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream. Let justice roll. Let justice flow like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream.
Good afternoon, New Eden Church family. It's a joy to look out and see faces, to be with you all today. I'm grateful for each of you, and I truly mean that, and your heart to see disciples made here in Decatur and to the ends of the earth. I do want to echo what Blake said about Perspectives class. Perspectives class is a class that me and my wife kind of took. We had a kid right in the middle of it, so we didn't make it to every class. But just everything I've heard about it and every class we went to, it was just very engaging for us. And what I love about it is it can be easy to think that if you're not called to go, then you don't have a part to play. And Perspectives lets us all know that we all have a part to play. And actually, to be obedient to the scriptures and to God's plan, we all should be engaged. And so at least go to the interest class, consider signing up, and I promise that you won't regret that. As you heard, we're in a new series. I'm super pumped about the series. I've loved the book of Amos for a long time, but just as I've gotten to dive in even more deeper in preparation for this series, it's come alive even more, and I truly believe that it's going to be a blessing to each of us as individuals and to our entire body corporately. Probably the most famous verse in the book of Amos comes from chapter 5, verse 24, which is also where the subtitle of our series comes from. That verse says, "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." And so it's a verse that was made famous during the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted that in his letter from the Birmingham jail, which is still incredibly applicable and timely today if you get a chance to read that letter. But in the letter, he's responding to some fellow pastors who have kind of encouraged him to just kind of quiet down and ease up a little bit about issues of justice. And so Martin Luther King Jr. responds, and he invokes the words of the prophet Amos, and he challenges their own complacency and apathy towards the plight of black men and women. And so it's an incredibly prophetic book, the book of Amos is, and it convicts us at deep levels. Now, if you were to just kind of read through the book of Amos in one sitting, which is only 9 chapters, I encourage you to do that if you get a chance, maybe multiple times throughout this series. It might be very dark. It might feel very hopeless at times. There could be some fear there, but that's intentional on the prophet Amos. He wants to make sure that we don't skim over the seriousness with which God takes the enacting of justice and care for our fellow man, and the seriousness with which God takes true worship. And so what I want to do as we go into this book, before we even jump in, I want to challenge us to sit in the discomfort and conviction, and sit in the weight of God's glory and the weight of what we're called to, because I promise there is also much hope to be found in the book. But here's what I want to get at. You cannot bypass conviction and repentance on the way to heart-level transformation. It's part of the journey and a necessary part of the journey. And so I just encourage us, when we feel that discomfort, lean in, don't pull away. Today we're just covering the introduction of the book, which is Amos 1, 1-2. You heard it read earlier. And from that, today we're going to look at 2 main characters, the lion and the shepherd. And if I had to give a title to this sermon, that's what it would be, the lion and the shepherd. But before we kind of dive into today's sermon, what we're going to do is just take a few minutes and get our bearings. We're going into a new book, and so we want to figure out where we're at in the story of the scriptures. Let's get the historical context. Let's get where we're at in the whole scope. Let's get the cultural context. Let's figure out who the prophet is talking to. And so because of that, it's going to be a little bit of a longer introduction than normal, but it's essentially an introduction to our entire series today. And so let's start right there in verse 1 that we just heard read. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So right away, we see the author of the book is the prophet Amos, who was a sheep herder, who we're going to look at a little closer to in a second. Tekoa was located in the kingdom of Judah, and I'll explain what that is in just a second. We're also given kind of a general time frame for when his prophesying would have taken place. So we're told that it's during the reign of Uzziah, king of Judah, and also Jeroboam, king of Israel. Now, for those like me that don't always remember the history and the chronological nature of the scriptures, because it's not written in chronological order, we're going to give you a quick overview of where we're at. And so I'm going to step over here to this screen. On the far left over here, or your left, you see Abraham. That's back in 2166 BC. So it's when God called Abraham to go, and it's when the nation of Israel essentially was began. And then you see Exodus, which is, so it grew into a great nation. They were enslaved, and then they were released, and the Exodus story was around 1446 BC. So you kind of follow the timeline this way. And then you see the period of the judges from 1385 to 1055 BC. This was the time when there were many judges. Israel obviously was rebellious, which pretty much most of the time, like all of us humans. And so the time of the judges was during that time. And then you see the first king. They raise up Saul as the first king, and then David and Solomon. That was from 1050 to about 930 BC. So those are the first three kings. That was the nation of Israel. That was 12 tribes. After Solomon, there was division, and the nation split into two. And that's when you see there were two, the divided kingdom, which is this line right here. In 931 BC, there was a divided kingdom. There was civil war infighting. Judah was the southern kingdom, and that was two tribes, which was Judah and Benjamin. So that became one, its own independent kingdom. And then the nation of Israel was the other 10 tribes, and that was the northern kingdom. And so there was fighting. That's why you see Amos mention two different kings in the same time period. One was the king of Judah, and one was the king of Israel. And then in 931 BC, the nation of Israel was taken captive and led astray by Assyria. Judah was taken captive in 586 by Babylon. I want to make sure that's right. So I'm telling you right, yes, that's correct. And then during all that time, you have a bunch of prophets. So you have your minor prophets, your major prophets speaking truth during that time. But around 400 BC, it all went silent, okay? And that was a period of silence for about 400 years before, I'm going to make the case today, the final prophet came on the scene, which was Jesus, from around 2 to 6 BC, depending on different people who, different opinions about that. But around that time frame, and then, of course, you go to AD time frame and start counting up, which is what we're in today, approximately 2,000 years later. So Amos, you can show where Amos shows up. Go to the next slide. Amos takes place right here, 765 to 760 BC. So not long before Israel was taken captive, which he's going to talk about some of that doom and gloom a little bit in the book. So this is around approximately when the prophet Amos prophesied. He probably didn't prophesy for longer than a year or two, most likely. And so that's kind of the time frame of when this book takes place. So that might have meant nothing to you. That's fine. Some of you might have loved that. I'm somewhere in the middle, and so we're just going to keep going. Hopefully that's helpful to you. So that's when the prophecy was taking place, but now we want to see who is Amos prophesying to, okay? The immediate message of the book is directed primarily at the nation of Israel, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. Judah does get addressed a little bit, but primarily it's directed to the 10 tribes of Israel. There were two, Jeroboam was the king of Israel at this time, we're told. There were two Jeroboams. This is the second Jeroboam. In 2 Kings 14, he was labeled as a king who did evil in the sight of the Lord. We're told that he led Israel to great sin. And so these are the people, and this is the king that Amos is going to be speaking his message to. Now, if you would have asked Israel at this time if they thought they were under God's judgment or they had anything to be concerned about, they would have scoffed at you. During this time, Israel had experienced great luxury and comfort and wealth. There were power vacuums in the surrounding countries, and so they amassed land and military power and might, and it turned them into this, from an earthly perspective, a wealthy, successful, flourishing nation. Unfortunately, though, as we're going to see in this book, this caused them to forget God. And it also caused them to not only have a wrong relationship with their covenant God, it led to a wrong relationship with their fellow man, and they began to oppress their fellow man. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and we're going to see examples of that throughout the book. And understanding that context will help the message of Amos make sense. And then lastly, before we kind of move into the sermon, this is all kind of introduction, we need to understand the genre of literature that this is. This is prophetic literature. And so the prophetic books are recording the sermons and messages that were spoken over a time period to a covenant people of God. Sometimes it would address the other nations, but primarily to the covenant people of God, accusing them of where they have failed to keep the covenant, calling them to repentance, warning them both of kind of this immediate physical doom and also this kind of cosmic spiritual doom if they didn't turn back to Yahweh, their God. And so remember, the nation had corporately agreed to worship God with this covenant, to reflect to the surrounding nations what it was like to live under the good rule and reign of God, but they had rejected that. And the prophets were there to point their eyes back to this covenant and remind them of that. But here's the thing that I want us to see. Amos does that a lot in the book, but God uses human instruments like Amos, but ultimately, it's the voice of God himself speaking. We see that right away in the introduction to this book in Amos chapter 1, verse 2. And he said, this is Amos speaking, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. So even though Amos is the one speaking, he tells us it's actually the Lord that's the voice roaring from Zion. And so that's pretty much the introduction. Now we're going to look at the first main character we see today, which is the lion. Amos tells us straight up that Yahweh, the Lord, is roaring from Zion, from Jerusalem. Amos wants to call to attention God's sovereign rule and the covenant that they had made with him. Jerusalem and Mount Zion held this temple, which was this place where God and humanity were supposed to flourish, to function together, where God had provided a way for people to meet him, even though they were full of sin. And even though they were unworthy, he provided a way for them. And so God, roaring from this place, is reminding the people that God is real, that he's alive, and that he's active in the affairs of men. See, the tendency in the culture here at Israel was to view God in two extremes. Either as kind of this grandpa-like figure that was sitting in a rocking chair, pretty much disinterested in what was going on, or this angry God that just wanted you to kind of do these rituals and feast to just keep him happy, to appease him, so he didn't lose his temper and get really mad and destroy you. And this reminds us of the same ways that in our culture, we tend to view God. We can see him either as this angry God, looking for us to mess up. And so we kind of keep the rules, whatever we think those rules are, out of fear, making sure we do the deeds like go to church and tithe so God won't get too angry at us and stay on our good side. And we can even flip that to the positive side. If we do a good enough job and we perform enough, then God will show us favor and we'll get the good job and we'll get the good spouse and the good house and whatever else that we want. And so we kind of make him like a genie in a bottle. We can earn some favors from him as a response to our performance. So that's one extreme. Or we see him as totally disinterested. You know, he kind of created the earth and humans. He kind of set it in motion. Maybe we'll even admit that. But then he kind of went to take a nap. And every now and then he might wake up, you know, if he gets really disturbed or angry, you know, like when you would sneak past your dad when you were a kid, you know, sleeping in the recliner. You didn't want to wake him up. But on the whole, he's pretty much taking a nap. He's disinterested. He's distant, not really engaged. And so this message from Amos, that God is roaring from an actual physical place, is a reminder to us of God's character and a challenge to us to not make God into our own image, to not assume that he operates as we do, reactively losing his temper over petty things and over controlling, or getting tired and taking naps over on the side. That's not God at all. God is active, and he is real, and he is a lion that cannot be tamed. His purposes cannot be thwarted, and when his people ignore his voice, he will roar and he will speak up. And Amos gives us this terrifyingly awesome picture of God, and he wants us to see it up close and personal, not just from a distance. I'm sure many of you saw the video from the explosion in Beirut this past week. And if you were like me, the first time you saw that, it was kind of like a shock. Like it was just huge. It felt like something out of a movie. And you were just captured by it, and different angles would come out, and you'd watch it. And we all were kind of maybe drawn to that from a safe distance, right? From our phones. Like, being there physically would have been a completely different story. We would have reacted much differently. But we like to kind of experience that to give us a thrill as long as we're safe. That's why we like to go to the zoo and see lions as long as they're in their cages, right? unless you're the Tiger King, and was it the Tiger King or Lion? Yeah, Tiger King, yeah. I looked at Bree like, I'm sure you loved it. But, like that seems like so long ago now. But, right, on the whole, like we like that stuff from a safe distance, right? You might want to go swimming with sharks, right, in your own little cage and stay comfortable. But Amos wants to make clear in this book that God is not someone that can be tamed or caged. You can't just kind of play with God when you want, keep him at a safe distance, kind of throw him a bone every now and then, like some animal or some man-made God. No, Yahweh is king. And he's definitely a good king, but his goodness is based on his standard, not our own. C.S. Lewis tried to capture this idea about God as, he called it not safe but good in the Chronicles of Narnia. They were going to meet the lion Aslan, and the beaver was telling Susan about this lion, and this was the conversation they had. The beaver said, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. And Susan said, ooh, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. See, the God of the scriptures is very real. He's very involved, and he cares deeply about the affairs of men, and he will raise his voice when he's being ignored. But what happens when this God speaks? What happens when he roars? See, a lot of times we say, we want to hear God speak. I just want to hear his voice. But if we actually listen, we might not like what he has to say. Because often, it runs antithetical to our own selfish desires and our own desire for power and comfort and control, and we want to be the king. This is exactly where Israel was, and we're going to see it more fully as we go through the book. But Israel assumed that their wealth and their comfort meant that God was blessing them. They equated their comfort and military security as evidence that God was happy with them. They assumed that maybe everyone else around them needed to be worried about the day of the Lord, but not them. The day of the Lord was the day when Yahweh would enact justice on the earth. So everyone else needs to worry about it, but we're good. But Amos sets the tone right away in this introduction to the book that no one is exempt from God's rule and reign, not even his own people. He's the Lion of Judah, and he roars against all who would stand against him. And then what happens when he speaks? Look at the end of verse 2. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. What is he doing here in this poetic imagery? When this lion speaks, the pastures mourn and the top of Carmel withers. See, both these references would have brought to Israel's mind a place of flourishing. Pastures where shepherds would take, and this is a shepherd who's prophesying, would take sheep, and it was lush, and they would graze in the green grass, and Carmel was known as this extremely lush mountain. But when this lion speaks, even those pastures mourn, and the top of Mount Carmel withers. Amos is setting the tone of this book. It's a wake-up call to Israel, and it's a wake-up call to the church today that we had better heed the voice of God when he speaks. It's not a game. God is not some genie in a bottle. He's not someone we can kind of cut out the parts we don't like. He's the creator of the universe, and it's terrifyingly awesome. But unlike a lion at the zoo or a shark in the ocean, you can't cage him in, and it's okay for us to sit in that weight and feel that. But we have to ask, why is he roaring? Is he just upset, Is he this angry God? We don't see it in these immediate verses, but we're going to see it throughout the entire book. The reason why God is roaring is that humans have become corrupt and unjust. Especially his very own people, the ones that were supposed to be the kingdom of priests, lights to the world, showing them the way, they had become corrupt. Even the leaders among them, they were ignoring the plight of the most vulnerable among them. They were oppressing the weak. They were abusing their power. They were taking advantage of the poor. They were apathetic and sitting on their recliners and ignoring the world around them. And God warns them that that is not okay. See, God is not just arbitrarily angry and petty like we are, right? Like he's not like me when I get mad at my kids because I step on a Lego that they left on the floor, right? Although that might be just anger. I'm not sure. That should be absolutely illegal to do. But seriously, God's wrath is not something that is reactionary. We can have that tendency because sometimes he's talked about that way. Like people can use God to try to get you to follow their own man-made rules. That's not what's going on here. This is very calculated. And God's wrath is always just. And I would contend that God's anger doesn't come because of an attribute of wrath. Rather, it comes from his attributes of justice and love that he's had from eternity past. Love for humanity and their good and their flourishing, and love for his own glory. See, God created this world. He is the creator of all things. And so he knows how it's supposed to function. He knows how it's supposed to work. He knows what causes humanity and his people to flourish and what causes them to be destroyed. And so when his creation is taking advantage or abusing other humans, he gets angry. Because he is just. He has to deal with the injustice. He has to deal with the brokenness. We get a glimpse of this when we hear of the depravity of things like slavery or racism or lynchings or human trafficking or child physical or sexual abuse or anything of the sort, and there's something in us that just cries out, like, do something. That's why we start asking, what can we do? Like, we can't just sit here and know that. And we get a glimpse of God screaming out because injustice is running rampant. And yes, he is so slow to anger because he loves us and he's patient and long-suffering, but he must deal with the things that are unjust. See, a lot of the imagery we're going to see in the book of Amos is a way for Amos to talk about the day of the Lord. I kind of mentioned that. It was this day when God was supposed to come judge the world and restore fortunes of Israel. But God wants to remind Israel that if you're not surrendered to God, if you're in rebellion against his good and just ways, then the day of the Lord is not something to look forward to, it's something to dread. It's not flourishing that waits for those in opposition to God. It's melting, it's wilderness, it's destruction. That's the result of selfish humans choosing their own way. And so we see the lion in verse 2. We're going to make our way back to verse 1 and look more deeply at our second character, the shepherd. Look at Amos 1:1. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa. So we actually don't know much about this Amos guy. Most likely, he had a very short time of prophesying. From verse 1, we see he was just this sheep herder, maybe a herdsman, maybe even overseeing multiple shepherds. But God chooses this kind of blue-collar worker to deliver this powerful message. He chooses him to speak his words to powerful people. And it's very intriguing to me. Because if I'm God and I'm like, hey, I really want to get this powerful message across, like, let me grab somebody wealthy, let me grab somebody with pedigree in the family, maybe a military leader, maybe one of my kings, and I'll kind of grab him and use them. And God can do that, but in this case, God chooses this very unlikely shepherd with no prophetic experience or background. In Amos chapter 7, verse 14, Amos is being scolded for prophesying by a priest because they don't like his message. And so look how Amos replies. He tells this guy, I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. And then he goes on to continue his message. He's like, don't blame me. Like, I was minding my own business. I was herding cattle, I was pruning figs, and God called me to prophesy to a bunch of you, so I had to obey. Like, I didn't choose the prophecy life, right? The prophecy life chose me. Got some laughs, look at that. But seriously, like, these couple verses are all we really know about this guy. We don't know much. He's this no-name dude who God chooses to use to thunder this crazy message of judgment and to call the nation to repent, which is a great message for us, that God can use anybody that's surrendered to him. See, through the words of Amos, we get glimpses into the character and nature of God. Because we don't make it about the person. We're making it about the words of God. We get to see what true justice is. We're going to get to see a God that cares about his covenant, a God that cares about the unborn, a God that cares about the poor and the oppressed and those in exile and the immigrant. He cares about violence and evil to the point that he intends to do something about it. The world was full of evil during this time, full of apathy, so 99% of Amos's words reflect that reality. You're going to see that if you read the book. He was speaking to an apathetic people who assumed they didn't need God. They assumed that they could appease him by singing their songs and doing their feast and absolutely ignoring his commands of doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. And nobody liked to hear that, but Amos prophesied faithfully, most likely completely ignored, but a faithful example of someone who remained committed to what God had called him to do, even though he stood alone. If we're honest, though, like, if we look at history, his message didn't actually seem to be that effective. The nation of Israel never did fully repent. They never did figure it out, and the hearts of humanity still remain selfish and evil. And it's not changed today. Just look around. They sought their own good above the needs of their brothers and sisters. They ignored justice, both systemically in the courts and individually in their own house. And so, why this book? Was it even worth it? All the time Amos spent. Did it do anything? See, as you read through this book, there's this longing in our hearts for resolution. There's this desire, like just read it. There's going to be a desire, like, give me some hope. This is pretty discouraging. We really don't get to see much until the last few verses of the book. And we're going to look at them because I want you to see them right now, and I want you to see where we're going. And we're going to look at it a lot throughout the series. The last few lines of the book are filled with hope. The day of the Lord is presented as a day of hope for those who are true Israel. There is a restoration coming. So look at these lines from the end of chapter 9. In that day I will raise up the booth or tent, is what that means, of David that has fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land. See, because of the people's rebellion, Mount Carmel would wither on the day of the Lord, and that's where the story should end, but God. But because of the grace of God, seen even all the way back in the Old Testament, the story doesn't end with pastures mourning and Carmel withering. Instead, the story ends with the mountains dripping sweet wine and the hills flowing with the same. It ends with gardens flourishing and a place of shalom, never more to be uprooted from their home. And notice in the verses, who's doing the raising up? Hint, it's God, not us. I will raise up. I will rebuild. I will establish. I will plant them. See, Amos, as surrendered as he was, could not transform hearts. He could make people aware of their sin. He could speak truth and speak the words of God, but he could not raise dead hearts to life. He couldn't create and cultivate change. He couldn't breathe on them the Spirit. So yes, in his grace, God sent the shepherd Amos to speak his words, but that was never meant to be the final shepherd or the final word. That was only a foretaste of what was coming one day, and that's why our hearts read the book and say, something else has to happen. And there is, because there's something a lot more in store and a lot better than Amos. After multiple prophets and multiple rejections of God's truth, and after 400 years of silence, the living word, God made flesh, came to make his tent among us. And it was this Logos, this living word, who John says was one with God, who came not only to tell us our problem, but brought himself as the solution. It was this unlikely baby boy, born in a cattle stall, the one who left heaven's throne and made his dwelling and pitched his tent among us, that would raise up the true tent of David. And through the words of the prophet Amos, we get a glimpse of God's character, but in the face of the word, the final prophet, Jesus Christ, we get the full, shining beam of God's glory, and what an incredible, beautiful, hopeful, grace-filled sight it is. With the life of Jesus, he enacts justice in the streets as he speaks truth to power, calls out corrupt systems, welcomes in the poor, the sick, the homeless, the outcast, reversing the curse. But he didn't just live as the living word. He also was the great true shepherd who laid down his life for the rebellious sheep. He's the true shepherd. In John chapter 10, Jesus tells his disciples what he came to do. He says, I'm the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture, flourishing. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus not only is the shepherd who speaks the words of the Father, he also lays down his life for the sheep so they may come in and find pasture. He transforms the mourning of the pastures and the melting of Carmel into hills of dancing and flowing abundant wine with food abundant for all who will admit they're hungry and they need something to eat because this world can't fill us. Jesus not only warned of death, he walked right into the darkest recesses of it himself. He absorbed in his body the full wrath that was justly due sinners, and he took the worst blow that evil could throw. He received in the bloody cross the most unjust, heinous crime ever committed, and he did it willingly to save us. See, no matter how much we try to fix our broken world, no matter how much we strive for perfect justice, no matter how many hashtags we tweet or clinics we protest or virtues we signal, something more has to be done. Those things can help us as outworkings of transformation, but they can't change hearts. And don't hear me say working for justice is useless. Like, we're going to get to see that in Amos, and you guys know my heart on that. I would actually argue it's necessary because faith without works is dead, but good works without faith in Jesus is absolutely damning. And we have to make sure that our motivation is God's glory, not acceptance from the world about whatever hot topic it is right now, because that'll fade. Here's the thing that we all have to grasp. Because there's sin in the hearts of every single one of us, because actual true justice would require that every single one of us be cast outside the kingdom, we need help. We need something more transformative than just a fresh start. We need something more powerful than just being made aware of our brokenness. That can only take us so far. We need something that can create, that brings life to death, that can defeat the hell and the grave, something that can rip out our hearts of stone and replace them with hearts of flesh that love Jesus, and that something we need is a someone, and his name is Jesus. And he can do it. Look at John 10 again. He's going on to talk, and he says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord." I've got authority to lay it down, and I've got authority to take it up again. See, no one actually took the life of Jesus. He laid it down so he could take it back up again. And the loudest roar of this lion was when he got back up from the grave and shred to freaking pieces death and Satan once and for all. And he does this by becoming the lamb slain. It doesn't make sense. It's upside down. It's backwards. It's as unlikely as a blue-collar shepherd prophesying on behalf of God to an entire nation, but it's the truth. And it's the life, death, and resurrection of this king, bringing into one all the families of the earth. That's the only hope we have. And he welcomes you in as well. This is the Jesus we want you to know. The one that knows true justice and cares. The one that doesn't just roar and warn of impending doom, but the one that walked into the doom on your behalf and stared it in the face. The one that makes us one with the Father, so we're loved the way Jesus is loved. This is absurd. It shouldn't happen. But when this happens, the day of the Lord is a day that we anticipate with joy and hope because of the work of Jesus. And we're finally getting what our hearts have always longed for, which is just to be one with our Creator. And it's going to happen. Jesus will return to make all things new and put all things to right. He will bring about the flourishing of all things. He will enact justice. Living water will flow from his throne through the streets, and mountains will drip with sweet wine. That's the eternal hope we have. We want you to trust him. We invite you to know Jesus like that if you don't. And for those of you that have experienced the transformative power of the gospel, this truth is what changes us. It's what reminds us of what really matters. And so when we, through this book, it's going to happen. You're going to recognize your own apathy, your own indifference, maybe to the poor, maybe to racism. Maybe you'll recognize your own love for money. The answer isn't to ease our guilt by posting something or giving handouts. Maybe God calls you to do that, okay? But the answer first is to repent and believe the gospel, to come face to face with our own brokenness and ask the Spirit to make fresh the reality of who Jesus has made us to be. And when we get what Jesus has done for us as the good shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep, when we get that reality, we are transformed into a people who reflect this shepherd, prophet, king in all of life. We become restorers of the walls in the here and the now. We build bridges. We partner with Jesus in bringing the kingdom come right now as it is in heaven as a foretaste. And so we're rightly motivated to see true, God-centered, Jesus-glorifying, Spirit-motivated justice in the courts and in our hearts. And it's all a foretaste of final resurrection when true justice will happen. And so knowing it's coming doesn't cause us to sit back and just wait for it. It encourages us to get busy because the battle's been won. And we've got a lion roaring behind us. We're in a preaching team, and Chris Kinney, we were going through this text, and he was like, I just envisioned like us as like these weaklings, but there's this lion just roaring behind us with all the power. And he deals with sin, but he's also the shepherd who gave his life to rescue us sheep. Only in Jesus can justice and mercy meet, and they do, most beautifully in the cross and resurrection. And so, my prayer for us, as we go through this book, that we are convicted of sin and apathy towards those around us who are hurting, but that we are also comforted by the abundant mercy we find in Jesus and willing to go to the ends of the earth and around the corner and in our own neighborhoods to take that good news to those who are hurting. That's the only thing that can really change us.